Have you ever found yourself staring at the night sky, overwhelmed by its vastness, and suddenly wondered, if God created the universe, then who created God? It's a question that has haunted philosophers, theologians, scientists, and everyday people for thousands of years. It's the kind of question that keeps you up at night, making you feel small yet deeply curious. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into this cosmic mystery. We're going to explore what it means to talk about God before creation, whether God has an origin, and what philosophers, theologians, and even modern scientists say about this. Grab a cup of tea or coffee, settle in, and let's go on a journey together. Milky Way. Why we ask about God's origin. As humans, we're naturally obsessed with beginnings. We want to know the origin of everything: the universe, life, consciousness, and even God. We love stories that start with, in the beginning, or, once upon a time. Because our minds are wired to think in terms of time, past, present, and future. When we see a painting, we ask, who painted it? When we see a building, we ask, who designed it? So, it's normal that when we look at this vast, finely tuned universe, we ask, who made it? And if someone says, God made it, then immediately we ask, okay, so who made God? But here's the twist. This question assumes that everything must have a cause. And while that makes sense for things inside the universe, it might not apply to God at all. Hourglass time and causality, our deeply human framework. We live inside time. Every moment of our lives is governed by clocks, calendars, deadlines, and milestones. Because of this, we instinctively believe that everything has to have a cause, a beginning point that set it in motion. But what if there is a reality that is completely beyond time? Modern physics tells us that time itself began with the Big Bang. There was no before the Big Bang in the way we understand before. Think about it. Before the universe, there was no ticking clock, no passing seconds. So asking what God was doing before creation is a bit like asking, what's north of the North Pole? The question itself doesn't make sense. Sparkles. What does eternal really mean? When people hear eternal, they often imagine something lasting for an infinite amount of time, like an immortal person who keeps living forever and ever. But in philosophical and theological language, eternal doesn't mean an endless stretch of time. It means outside of time altogether. God isn't an extremely old man sitting somewhere in the clouds for billions of years. Rather, God exists in a different mode of existence, one that transcends time completely. In other words, God doesn't experience yesterday, today, and tomorrow like we do. All of God's life is one eternal present, a continuous, unchanging, now. Brain. Philosophical views. Aristotle and Aquinas. Let's take a look at what some of the greatest thinkers have said about this. Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher, introduced the concept of an unmoved mover. He reasoned that everything in motion must have been set in motion by something else. But if we keep going backward, we can't have an infinite chain of movers. There must be a first mover that itself is unmoved. Thomas Aquinas, one of the greatest Christian philosophers and theologians, built on Aristotle's idea. He called this first mover God. Aquinas argued that God is a necessary being, a being that cannot not exist. Everything else is contingent, it depends on something else for its existence. But God is pure existence itself. God doesn't receive being, God is being. That's a mind-blowing thought. God is not just something that happens to exist. God is existence itself. Open book. Biblical and theological insights. In the Bible, when Moses asks God for his name, God replies, I am Whoiam. Exodus chapter 3 verse 14. This might sound strange at first, but it's profound. God doesn't identify as, I was created by, or, I came from. Instead, he simply is. Christian theology has always emphasized this self-existence of God. In the Nicene Creed, Christians declare that God is begotten, not made, and of one being with the Father. The Church Fathers, from Augustine to Gregory of Nyssa, emphasized that God's essence is unchanging and timeless. God is not part of creation, he is the source of creation. Microscope science and the beginning of time. Modern science, especially cosmology, gives us fascinating insights. The Big Bang Theory tells us that space and time themselves began about 13.8 billion years ago. Before that moment, there was no space to move around in, and no time to mark events. Stephen Hawking once explained that asking what happened before the Big Bang is like asking what's south of the South Pole. There simply is no before in a temporal sense. So, if time itself began with the Big Bang, then God, as the cause of all that exists, must be outside time. This matches beautifully with the theological idea of God being eternal, not just very old, but completely beyond time. Cyclone the infinite regress problem. Let's go back to that instinctive question. Who created God? If we say God was created by another being, then we would ask, who created that being? And then, who created the creator of that being? This would lead us to an infinite regress. If everything needed a cause, there would never be a starting point. We'd be stuck in an endless loop. Philosophers agree that an infinite regress of causes is logically impossible when it comes to explaining existence. There must be a first cause, a necessary being, that itself needs no cause. That being, by definition, is what we call God. What about other gods and myths? Some people argue, many ancient cultures had their own gods. Why assume there's one eternal God? It's true. Ancient civilizations had many gods, often human-like and limited, fighting among themselves. These were gods within time and space. But the idea of an ultimate, uncaused, eternal being is fundamentally different. This concept doesn't describe a super-powerful creature, but rather the very ground of all being. In other words, the God discussed in classical theism isn't just one being among many, he is being itself. Light bulb misunderstandings about God's nature. A common mistake is to imagine God as a super-advanced alien or wise old wizard sitting somewhere far away. But God is not a creature within the universe. God is not part of the chain of caused things. God is outside of that chain entirely. Another misunderstanding is to think that saying, God has no cause, is a cop-out. But logically, the uncaused cause is necessary to explain why anything exists at all. If everything were contingent and needed a cause, then ultimately, nothing could exist, settling the difference between contingent and necessary beings. A contingent being is something that depends on something else to exist. For example, a tree depends on the sun, water, soil, and a seed. Humans are also contingent. We rely on parents, air, food, and countless other conditions. But a necessary being is one that contains the reason for its existence within itself. It doesn't depend on anything outside itself to exist. Only one being fits that description: God. Milky Way God outside of space and time. God is not located somewhere in the universe, hiding behind a distant galaxy or beyond the farthest star. God doesn't live inside space, he sustains space itself. Augustine once said, God is everywhere, but not in space. That sounds paradoxical, but it shows that God's presence is not spatial but spiritual and metaphysical. What was God doing before creation? A classic question. Saint Augustine famously answered, God was not doing anything because there was no before for him to do anything in. Time itself is part of creation. So the idea of God waiting for billions of years to create the universe doesn't make sense. From God's eternal perspective, creation is not an event in a timeline but an expression of his will, always present to him. Balance scale. The who created God argument in atheism. Many atheists use who created God as a quick rebuttal against the existence of God. But as we've seen, the argument is based on a misunderstanding. If God were a contingent being inside time and space, then yes, we'd have to ask who created him. But by definition, God is not that kind of being. God is the necessary ground of existence, the uncaused cause, the source of all. Hibiscus. Is it possible for humans to fully understand this? Honestly, probably not. Our minds are shaped by time, space, and causality. Thinking outside those limits is incredibly hard. But that doesn't mean it's irrational. Many truths in science, like quantum mechanics or relativity, are also counterintuitive yet true. Similarly, God's nature transcends our categories, and that's part of what makes the mystery so profound and beautiful. Folded hands, the beauty of mystery. Sometimes people think mystery is a weakness in religion, as if not knowing everything is a flaw. But mystery invites us deeper. It invites humility and wonder. God's transcendence, His being beyond our full understanding, is not a barrier to faith, but a doorway to awe. It reminds us that we are finite, and that there's something greater beyond us, calling us higher. Speech balloon. What this means for you. So, what does all this mean in your daily life? It means that when you think about God, you're not thinking about just another being among many. You're thinking about the very reason why anything exists at all. It means you don't have to try to imagine God as an old man with a long beard or a cosmic engineer tweaking planets. Instead, imagine pure existence. Imagine infinite love and infinite mind. That is closer to the reality of God than any human picture. Checkmark. Conclusion. Who was God before creation? To wrap it up, who was God before creation? God simply is. There was no before, because time itself is part of creation. God is eternal, uncaused, and necessary, the ground of all being. It's a mystery that challenges us, stretches our minds, and invites us into deeper reflection and awe. What do you think? Do you feel this concept makes sense? Do you still have questions or doubts? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so you won't miss the next big question we explore together. Thank you for watching. Stay curious, and keep seeking.